Chapter 1. The Troubled Tea Party. The June sunshine caressed the emerald lawns of St. Mary Mead with unusual generosity that afternoon. Miss Jane Marple had just finished deadheading her prize roses when her garden gate creaked open to reveal the plump figure of Mrs. Dolly Bantry. The Colonel's wife clutched her hat against the gentle breeze, her face flushed with more than just the summer heat. "Jane!" "Oh, Jane, you simply must come," Mrs. Bantry called, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. "The Vicar's tea party is in an absolute state. Dr. Faraday has taken ill, quite suddenly, and it's the most peculiar thing." Miss Marple set down her gardening shears with deliberate calm. At 82, she had long since learned that haste rarely improved matters, particularly when something was amiss. She removed her gloves methodically, one finger at a time. "Taken ill? How unusual! Edward Faraday has always been the picture of health," she remarked, her pale blue eyes sharp with interest despite her mild tone. "What sort of illness, Dolly?" "That's just it," Mrs. Bantry replied, lowering her voice despite the absence of other listeners. "He collapsed in the middle of passing the cucumber sandwiches, went entirely blue around the lips. Inspector Craddock is there now. He happened to be taking tea with the vicar, and he's not letting anyone leave. Inspector Craddock. Then he suspects poison," Mrs. Bantry whispered, the word carrying on the breeze like a fallen leaf. "The inspector won't say as much, but Dr. Haydock arrived and has been most peculiar about the teacups. Won't let anyone wash them up." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And the vicar's annual tea party. Who was in attendance today?" Mrs. Bantry ticked off names on her fingers. "The usual crowd. Colonel Prothero and his young wife. She wore the most inappropriate dress, scarlet of all things, for afternoon tea. The new librarian, Miss Clement, quiet girl, keeps to herself. Professor Redding, who's staying at the Blue Boar while researching local history. Oh, and that nephew of the vicar's, Lawrence Timmons, the one who's always in need of money. He arrived unexpectedly this morning from London. And Mrs. Faraday, of course," Miss Marple added. "Yes, though she's been in the strangest mood all afternoon. Hardly spoke 2 words, even before the doctor collapsed. And now she's sitting there, white as a sheet, while the inspector asks his questions." Mrs. Bantry paused for breath. "Jane, you really must come. The inspector respects you, ever since that business with the Prescott diamonds. Perhaps you'll see something we've all missed." Miss Marple permitted herself the faintest of smiles. People so often underestimated what an elderly lady might observe from the sidelines of village life. She had long since stopped correcting their misconception. "I'll need my other hat," she said simply, turning toward her cottage door. 20 minutes later, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry arrived at the vicarage, where the garden party atmosphere had dissolved into tense, hushed conversations. Small clusters of villagers huddled beneath the ancient oak trees, their teacups abandoned on white-clothed tables. In the centre of the lawn, Inspector Craddock directed his constable in cordoning off the refreshment table with string. The vicar, Leonard Clement, paced the garden path, his clerical collar askew, and his usual gentle expression replaced by one of bewildered concern. When he spotted Miss Marple, relief washed over his features. "Miss Marple, thank heavens you've come. Such a dreadful business, poor Edward. They've taken him to the hospital in Much Benham, but Dr. Haydock wasn't optimistic. I am so very sorry. Vicar, Miss Marple said, genuine sympathy in her voice. Dr. Faraday is a good man. Perhaps it was simply the heat. The vicar shook his head. Inspector Craddock seems to think otherwise. He's been most insistent about examining everything that Edward consumed. My sister is beside herself, as you know. She prepared most of the refreshments herself. And Mrs. Faraday, I understand she was present when it happened. A shadow crossed the vicar's face. Yes, though she and Edward had been rather distant with each other today. Some disagreement before the guests arrived, I believe. She's inside now, lying down. Dr. Haydock gave her a mild sedative before leaving for the hospital. Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the garden, noting Colonel Prothero's thunderous expression as he argued quietly with his much younger wife. The new librarian, Miss Clement, sat alone beneath the wisteria, her eyes red-rimmed. Professor Redding appeared to be sketching something in a small notebook, his academic detachment seemingly undisturbed by the afternoon's events. And the doctor's nephew? Lawrence, I believe, Mrs. Bantry said. Ah, yes. Lawrence arrived unexpectedly this morning. Says he's between positions in London. He and Edward had a private conversation in the study before the party. Raised voices were heard, I'm afraid. The vicar lowered his tone. Financial matters, one presumes. It's not the first time Lawrence has sought assistance. Inspector Craddock looked up from his work and, spotting Miss Marple, raised a hand in greeting. He excused himself from the constable and made his way across the lawn. Miss Marple, he nodded respectfully. I might have known you'd appear when trouble brews in St. Mary Mead. Good afternoon, Inspector. I understand Dr. Faraday has been taken ill under suspicious circumstances. The inspector's weathered face remained professional, but his eyes conveyed concern. Between us, Miss Marple, the symptoms suggest cyanide poisoning. Fast-acting, likely, administered in either his tea or one of the refreshments. Dr. Haydock is running tests at the hospital, but he left the sentence unfinished, but Miss Marple understood. Edward Faraday, the town's most respected physician, was unlikely to survive the night. Most distressing, she murmured. Had the doctor mentioned any enemies recently? Any unusual patients or disturbing encounters? Not according to his wife, though she's in no state for detailed questioning at present. The inspector hesitated. There is the matter of his will, however. It seems Dr. Faraday recently made significant changes. His practice nurse mentioned it to my constable. She witnessed the new document just last week. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Indeed? How interesting. And who would benefit from these changes, I wonder? That's what I intend to find out, said the inspector grimly. Along with who had access to the tea service before it was brought outside. A sudden commotion from the vicarage drew their attention. The door had burst open, and Mrs. Faraday, a slender woman in her 50s with prematurely silver hair, stumbled onto the porch, her face contorted with grief. "He's gone!" she cried, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent garden. "The Ye hospital just telephoned. Edward is dead." As the garden erupted in shocked exclamations, Miss Marple observed the reactions of each guest with careful attention. Colonel Prothero's hand tightened on his wife's arm. The librarian turned away, her shoulders shaking. Professor Redding closed his notebook with deliberate care. And Lawrence Timmins, standing half-hidden behind a rhododendron bush, quickly composed his startled expression into one of appropriate sorrow, but not before Miss Marple had glimpsed something else entirely in his eyes, something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. Chapter 2. Whispers. Among the Tombstones. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had transformed into a hive of whispered theories and pointed glances. The village shop did more business before noon than it typically managed in a week, as residents found sudden needs for flour or tea that might justify lingering to exchange the latest gossip about Dr. Faraday's shocking demise. Miss Marple, however, chose a different venue for her morning constitutional. The ancient churchyard provided both solitude and an excellent vantage point from which to observe the comings and goings at the vicarage next door. She knelt beside her sister's grave, ostensibly tending to the forget-me-nots she had planted there years ago, while her keen eyes noted Lawrence Timmins pacing in the vicarage garden, cigarette in hand. "Such a lovely tribute, Miss Marple," came a gentle voice from behind her. Miss Marple turned to find the new librarian, Miss Clement, standing a respectful distance away. In daylight, the young woman's features revealed themselves to be pleasant, rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes that seemed to notice more than she let on. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, rising slowly. "My sister was particularly fond of these little blue flowers, not unlike the ones in that charming brooch you're wearing." Miss Clement's hand flew instinctively to the small silver pin at her collar. "How observant of you! It was my mother's. I don't usually wear jewellery, but after yesterday's events I needed something comforting." "Perfectly understandable. Death often makes us seek connections to those we've loved and lost." Miss Marple brushed soil from her gardening gloves. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Jane Marple, Sylvia Clement. I've been the village librarian for just over 3 months now." She hesitated. "I know this may sound peculiar, but I feel I should tell someone. Dr. Faraday visited the library last week and seemed troubled." Miss Marple's interest quickened, though her expression remained mild. "Troubled? In what way?" He requested several old newspaper archives, specifically from 15 years ago. He spent hours reviewing them, making notes. When I asked if I could help, he said something curious about old mistakes finding new victims. Then yesterday at the tea party, just before it happened, he passed me a note. Miss Clement glanced around nervously before extracting a folded paper from her pocket. It says, "Archive Box 17, June 15th, 1938 ST." Miss Marple examined the note, written in a physician's characteristic scrawl. "Most interesting. And have you looked?" "The archives were locked when I returned last night. I was going there now, actually." Miss Clement hesitated. Would you care to accompany me? I must admit, after what happened, I'm rather uneasy about investigating this alone." Before Miss Marple could respond, the lich gate creaked open, admitting Inspector Craddock and a stone-faced Colonel Prothero into the churchyard. The Colonel's face was flushed with indignation. "Preposterous, Inspector!" My wife and I were seated at opposite ends of the garden from Faraday. How could either of us have possibly interfered with his tea? "Nevertheless, Colonel, I must account for everyone's movements," Craddock replied with practised patience, "especially given your heated disagreement with the doctor last month regarding your wife's prescription. Medical incompetence should be called out, sir, when Anmarie developed those palpitations." The Colonel broke off, noticing Miss Marple and Miss Clement. Ladies, good morning. Terrible business this, simply terrible. Indeed, Colonel, Miss Marple agreed. Such a shock to the entire village. Dr. Faraday had been our physician for over 20 years. And now Haydock confirms it was poison, the Colonel muttered. Cyanide of all things. Who would have access to such a substance? Many people, unfortunately, said Inspector Craddock. Photographers use it in developing solutions. Certain fumigation chemicals contain it. Even some fruit seeds, naturally. The Professor, interrupted Colonel Prothero, snapping his fingers. That academic fellow who's always sketching plant specimens, Redding, wasn't it? Probably has all manner of chemicals for his research. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Professor Redding does seem rather interested in our local flora. I noticed him collecting samples from the Vicarage garden yesterday, shortly before the tea was served. The inspector's gaze sharpened. Did you indeed, Miss Marple? I'd value your observations from yesterday if you'd be willing to share them. Of course, Inspector, though I fear they're quite ordinary. I did notice Mrs. Faraday seemed particularly attentive to the doctor's cup. She insisted on pouring for him personally, despite Mrs. Clement, the vicar's sister, normally handling the tea service. The churchyard fell silent as the implications settled over the small group. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Faraday again. She was too distraught for detailed questioning yesterday. Poor woman, Miss Clement murmured. To lose her husband so suddenly. Yes, though I understand their marriage had been rather strained of late, Miss Marple remarked casually. My grandnephew Tom delivers their newspaper, and he mentioned overhearing quite a heated exchange last week. Something about a position at a London hospital that Dr. Faraday had declined without consulting his wife. Colonel Prothero harumphed. Faraday never struck me as a man who could be led by a woman, even his wife. Stubborn as they come. It's why I took Anmarie to that specialist in Much Benham instead. A rustle from behind the church's ancient yew tree caught Miss Marple's attention. Professor Redding emerged, his tweed jacket dusty with pollen, a leather-bound notebook in his gloved hands. Ah, good morning, he called with academic detachment. Fascinating specimens in this churchyard. Victorian gravesites often develop unique microecosystems due to the enclosed nature of... He stopped, noticing the tension in the group. I do beg your pardon. Have I interrupted something? Not at all, Professor, Inspector Craddock replied, smoothly. Though I would like a word about your activities yesterday afternoon. Of course, Inspector. I'd be delighted to assist. Such a tragedy about Dr. Faraday. The professor removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief, though between us I wasn't entirely surprised. Oh? The inspector's tone remained neutral. And why is that? Professor Redding replaced his glasses, blinking owlishly. Well, one couldn't help but notice the tension between certain parties. That nephew of his, for instance, Lawrence Timmins. I overheard him telling the doctor that time was running out. Quite an ominous statement in retrospect, wouldn't you agree? As if summoned by his name, Lawrence Timmins appeared at the vicarage gate, his handsome face set in lines of practised grief. Upon seeing the gathered group, he hesitated before squaring his shoulders and approaching. Inspector, he nodded. I was just coming to find you. There's something you should know about my uncle's will. Something that changes everything. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Beneficiary. "The will was changed just last week," Lawrence Timmins announced, his voice carrying an undercurrent of controlled emotion. "My uncle cut me out entirely and left everything to the church-building fund." Inspector Craddock's eyebrows rose slightly. "Everything? Including the house on Elm Street?" "Every penny," Lawrence confirmed bitterly. "Did I thought you should know, because it completely undermines your theory that I might have wanted him dead. Why would I poison the very man I was counting on for my inheritance?" Miss Marple's fingers toyed absently with her gardening gloves, her eyes downcast in a perfect picture of elderly disinterest. Yet her mind was calculating swiftly. If Lawrence had only just discovered his disinheritance, it could have provided a motive rather than dispelled one, assuming he had learned about it before the tea party. "When exactly did you become aware of these changes to your uncle's will, Mr. Timmins?" she asked mildly. Lawrence turned to her with a start, as if only just registering her presence. "Yesterday morning, Miss Marple." "Jane Marple?" she supplied. "Miss Marple. Yes, my uncle informed me during our discussion in his study. He claimed I had squandered enough of his money over the years." A flush crept up Lawrence's neck. "He said it was time I stood on my own 2 feet. Sensible advice," Colonel Prothero muttered. "Seen too many young men these days expecting handouts." Lawrence's eyes flashed. "Easy for you to say, Colonel. Some of us weren't born with silver spoons and country estates." "That's quite enough," Inspector Craddock intervened. "Mr. Timmins, if your uncle did indeed change his will to exclude you, the question remains, who benefits from his death now?" Hushed, uncomfortable silence settled over the churchyard. Professor Redding cleared his throat. "I believe Mrs. Faraday would still receive her widow's portion, regardless of the amended will. And from what I understand, the doctor's practice was quite lucrative. Steady income for 20 years, Colonel Prothero confirmed. A man charged £1 just to look at you, and £2 if he prescribed anything. Highway robbery, if you ask me." Miss Clement, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Dr. Faraday wasn't motivated by money. He often treated poorer patients for free. Mrs. Bellwether told me he never charged her for little Tommy's monthly visits, not once in 3 years. How very charitable," Lawrence commented with a hint of sarcasm. "Uncle Edward, patron saint of lost causes." "Speaking of the church," Miss Marple interjected gently, "I wonder if the vicar was aware of Dr. Faraday's generous bequest to the building fund. It would certainly solve the problem of the leaking roof that Reverend Clement has been concerned about for so long." Inspector Craddock's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "An excellent question, Miss Marple. I shall ask him directly." He turned to Lawrence. "Mr. Timmins, I'd appreciate if you would make yourself available for further questioning. Please don't leave the village without informing me." Lawrence stiffened. "Am I a suspect, Inspector?" "Everyone who attended that tea party is a person of interest, Mr. Timmins. Now, if you'll excuse me." As the inspector departed toward the vicarage, the small group began to disperse. Colonel Prothero offered a stiff bow before marching away, muttering about needing to check on his wife. Professor Redding returned to his botanical examinations, leaving Miss Marple alone with Miss Clement and Lawrence Timmins. "Miss Clement," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "I believe you were about to show me something at the library. Perhaps Mr. Timmins would care to join us." Lawrence looked momentarily startled by the invitation. "The library? I'm not sure what—" "Archive Box 17, Miss Clement prompted, studying Lawrence's face carefully. "June 15th, 1938. Does that mean anything to you, Mr. Timmins?" The colour drained from Lawrence's face so rapidly that Miss Marple feared he might faint. "Where did you hear about that?" he demanded. "Your uncle left Miss Clement a note referring to it," Miss Marple explained, watching his reaction with interest. "Just before he collapsed." Lawrence ran a hand through his dark hair. "I'll come with you," he said after a pause. "There are things about my uncle, about this whole situation, that you should understand." 20 minutes later, the trio sat in the hushed interior of St. Mary Mead's small library. Miss Clement had retrieved a dusty cardboard box from the archives room, laying it carefully on a reading table, secluded in the reference section. "Local newspapers from May through July, 1938, she explained, lifting the lid. Dr. Faraday was particularly interested in the June issues. With careful fingers, Miss Marple began examining the yellowed pages of the County Gazette. Lawrence sat rigidly in his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Miss Marple said softly after several minutes of silent searching. "Perhaps this is what the doctor found significant." She turned the newspaper to face her companions. A small article, tucked away on page 7, carried the headline, "Local Child Drowns in Tragic Accident." Miss Clement leaned forward to read aloud. "The body of 7-year-old Samuel Timmins was recovered from Gossington Lake yesterday evening. The boy had been reported missing by his guardian, Dr. Edward Faraday, after apparently wandering away during a lakeside picnic. Police have ruled the death accidental drowning. The child's parents perished in a motor accident last year, leaving him in the care of his uncle, who expressed profound grief over the tragedy." Lawrence's face had gone ashen. "Samuel was my brother," he said hoarsely. "I was only 5 when it happened. Uncle Edward raised me afterward, but we never spoke of Samuel. It was forbidden." "How terrible for you both," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. "To lose your brother, and for your uncle to lose his first ward." Lawrence's laugh held no humour. "Is that what he told people? That Samuel was his ward too?" He shook his head. "Samuel was his son, Miss Marple. His illegitimate son by my aunt, my mother's sister. When my parents died, he took us both in. Samuel because he was blood, and me because, well, I suppose, because it would have looked strange to separate us." Miss Clement gasped softly. "But why would Dr. Faraday be researching this now, after all these years?" "Because someone sent him a letter," Lawrence replied grimly. "I found it in his study yesterday while looking for his will. An anonymous note claiming Samuel didn't drown accidentally." He swallowed hard. "It suggested he was pushed." "Pushed?" Miss Marple repeated, her gentle voice belying the sharp attention in her eyes. "By whom?" "The note didn't say, but its timing can't be coincidence. Someone wanted to torment my uncle with this, just before—" Lawrence broke off as the library door swung open. Mrs. Faraday stood in the entrance, her black morning dress emphasizing the pallor of her face, her eyes locked on the newspaper article still visible on the table. "So you know," she said flatly, "after all these years, Edward's precious secret is out." Her hand trembled slightly as she approached their table. "I always told him the truth would surface eventually," Secrets in villages like this one always do. Mrs. Faraday, Miss Marple began carefully. Did you know about the anonymous letter your husband received? The widow's bitter smile contained no warmth. Know about it? Miss Marple, I wrote it. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. You wrote the letter. Lawrence stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Why would you torment him like that? Mrs. Faraday regarded him with cool detachment. Torment? I merely reminded Edward of his greatest sin, one for which he never paid the price. She sank gracefully into an empty chair, her black-gloved hands folding neatly in her lap. For years, I've lived in the shadow of Samuel's ghost. Edward would visit his grave every month, leaving those ridiculous toy soldiers. He grieved for that child more deeply than he ever loved me. Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the tension. But why now, Mrs. Faraday? After all these years, what prompted you to raise this painful history? The widow's composure faltered momentarily. Because I discovered he was planning to confess everything. The vicar showed me a letter Edward had written, requesting a private meeting to unburden his soul of a terrible secret. He was going to destroy everything we'd built, our reputation, our standing in the community. So you confronted him about it, Miss Clement said quietly. Of course I did. Mrs. Faraday's voice rose before she controlled herself with visible effort. Edward claimed it was a matter of conscience, said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Guilt, she nearly spat the word, as if his precious conscience was more important than my life, my position. Lawrence leaned forward. What exactly happened to my brother, Mrs. Faraday? Do you know something beyond what was reported? Before she could answer, the library door opened again, admitting Inspector Craddock. His shrewd gaze took in the scene. The old newspaper, the archive box, the palpable tension between the three seated figures. I've been looking for you, Mrs. Faraday, he said. The toxicology results have come back. Your husband's death was indeed caused by cyanide poisoning, specifically from bitter almond oil. Mrs. Faraday blinked rapidly. Bitter almond? But that's a key ingredient in your special marzipan cake, the inspector finished. The very cake you personally served to your husband yesterday afternoon. A shocked silence fell over the library. Mrs. Faraday's hand fluttered to her throat. This is absurd. I've been making that cake for years. Edward always requested it for special occasions. Then perhaps you can explain why traces of cyanide were found only in your husband's slice, Craddock said evenly, and why a bottle of bitter almond extract with an unusual concentration was discovered in your kitchen pantry this morning. I'm being framed, Mrs. Faraday whispered, her eyes darting between their faces. Someone is trying to make me appear guilty. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Inspector, may I ask who had access to Mrs. Faraday's kitchen before the tea party? According to the vicar's sister, several people helped prepare food for the event. Mrs. Bantry brought her famous cucumber sandwiches. Miss Clement here contributed some cheese straws. Professor Redding arrived early and offered to help carry trays. He focused on Mrs. Faraday. But only you prepared the marzipan cake by all accounts. This is preposterous, Mrs. Faraday said, rising to her feet. I had no reason to kill Edward. Despite our disagreements, he was worth far more to me alive than dead. And yet, Inspector Craddock said calmly, You've just admitted to sending him a threatening letter about a tragic incident from his past, one that he was apparently ready to confess to the vicar. Some might call that a motive. I didn't mean—" Mrs. Faraday stopped herself. "I want my solicitor present before I say anything further." "As you wish." Inspector Craddock gestured toward the door. "In the meantime, I'll need you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning." As Mrs. Faraday was escorted out, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the newspaper article. 15 years is a long time to harbour a secret, she murmured. I wonder what prompted Dr. Faraday's sudden crisis of conscience. Lawrence shook his head. It doesn't make sense. Uncle Edward was a master at compartmentalizing. He never showed the slightest guilt about Samuel in all the years I lived with him. Something changed, Miss Clement suggested, or someone forced his hand. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In my experience, buried secrets rarely stay buried forever. They have a way of pushing to the surface, like bulbs planted too shallow in winter. The library fell silent as each of them contemplated this botanical wisdom. After a moment, Miss Marple carefully refolded the newspaper. Miss Clement, I wonder if you might check if there are any other articles about Samuel in the following weeks. Sometimes the most telling details appear in the follow-up stories, after initial interest has waned. As Miss Clement began examining later papers, Lawrence shifted uncomfortably. I should probably tell you. There's something else you should know about my uncle. Miss Marple's blue eyes regarded him steadily. Yes, Mr. Timmins. His relationship with Professor Redding wasn't what it appeared. They weren't simply acquaintances. They were colleagues, Miss Marple supplied helpfully. Rivals, Lawrence finished. Years ago, they both courted Mrs. Faraday, Elaine Summers, as she was then. Uncle Edward won, obviously, but there's always been bad blood between them. And recently, I overheard them arguing about some research paper. The professor accused my uncle of stealing his work on a rare plant toxin. Plant toxin? Miss Clement looked up sharply from her newspaper search. Like cyanide. Exactly like cyanide, came a new voice from the library entrance. Professor Redding stood there, his academic demeanour giving way to obvious agitation. And I can explain everything if you'll give me the chance. It seems explanations are becoming quite fashionable today, Miss Marple observed mildly. Please do join us, Professor. The professor approached their table, removing his spectacles to polish them nervously. I had no idea Edward had been poisoned until the inspector mentioned it just now. But I did suspect something was wrong at the tea party. Edward and I had an understanding about the plant toxin research, Lawrence prompted. Among other things, Redding admitted, Edward and I maintained a professional rivalry, yes, but we also collaborated occasionally. Most recently, on a paper about natural sources of cyanide in common garden plants. We'd identified several previously unknown concentrations in certain cultivars. Miss Marple's interest visibly sharpened. Such as? Hydrangeas, for one. The leaves contain significant amounts when processed correctly, and certain apple varieties, their seeds specifically. He hesitated. Edward was particularly interested in methods of extraction and concentration. For medical purposes, Miss Clement asked. The professor's laugh held no humour. Officially, yes, but privately, Edward confessed a different motive. He was being blackmailed. The revelation hung in the air like a suspended note. Blackmailed, Lawrence repeated. By whom? About what? He wouldn't say. He only mentioned it involved something that happened many years ago, something he couldn't allow to become public. The professor's gaze fell on the archive box. I see. You've found what I suspect was at the heart of it. Miss Marple studied the professor's face carefully. Did Dr. Faraday mention creating cyanide for personal use, Professor? Not explicitly, but he did ask unusually detailed questions about untraceable delivery methods. Redding sighed heavily. I assumed he was considering ending his own suffering should the blackmail become unbearable. I never imagined someone would use our research to murder him instead. Lawrence stood abruptly. This is madness. If Uncle Edward was being blackmailed about Samuel's death, why change his will to cut me out? Why antagonize the only family he had left? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, to protect you from whatever consequences he feared were coming. Or perhaps... She stopped as Miss Clement gasped softly. I've found something, the librarian said, holding up a smaller newspaper from 3 weeks after Samuel's drowning. A short notice about the cremation of Samuel Timmins. It mentions that, at the request of his guardian, Dr. Edward Faraday, no autopsy was performed due to the child's evident cause of death. No autopsy, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How convenient. Lawrence's face had grown pale. Are you suggesting my brother didn't drown? That Uncle Edward— I'm not suggesting anything, dear, Miss Marple assured him, merely noting that your uncle seems to have been very careful about certain details. Professor Redding cleared his throat. There's one more thing you should know. The day before the tea party, Edward came to me in a state of extreme agitation. He said only 3 words. She knows everything. Chapter 5. A hidden connection. She knows everything, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. One must wonder who she might be. Lawrence's face darkened. Mrs. Faraday, obviously. She admitted sending that threatening letter. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Yet, if Dr. Faraday feared his wife's knowledge, why would he eat cake that she specifically prepared for him? Miss Clement looked up from the newspaper she'd been studying. He might not have known she was behind the anonymous letter. Or, Professor Redding interjected, he didn't believe she would actually harm him. After all, they had been married for over 20 years. The library door opened once again, admitting Colonel Prothero's young wife, Anmarie. Her scarlet dress from the tea party had been replaced by a more subdued navy ensemble, though it still managed to emphasize her figure in a way that drew Professor Redding's immediate attention. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her French accent more pronounced than usual. "The inspector suggested I might find you all here. He wishes everyone to gather at the vicarage this afternoon." Her gaze settled curiously on the newspapers scattered across the table. "Have I interrupted something important?" "Not at all, Mrs. Prothero," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "We were just reviewing some local history. Did Inspector Craddock mention why he wants us to gather?" Anmarie shrugged elegantly. "He said only that he has questions about the seating arrangements at yesterday's tea party. So tedious, these police formalities." "Indeed," Professor Redding murmured, still watching her with unconcealed interest. "Though I suppose it's necessary to establish who had access to the doctor's food and drink." Anne-Marie's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "You believe someone deliberately poisoned Dr. Faraday?" "The evidence certainly suggests it," Lawrence D. replied grimly, "and apparently my aunt is the prime suspect." "Elaine?" Anne-Marie looked genuinely surprised. "But why would she harm Edward? They seemed—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Comfortable together. Comfortable isn't the same as happy," Miss Clement observed quietly. "And Mrs. Faraday had reasons to be upset with her husband recently." Anne-Marie nodded slowly. "Yes, I had heard something about tension between them. The Colonel mentioned Dr. Faraday had been behaving strangely these past few weeks, cancelling their weekly chess matches, appearing distracted during conversations." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You seem quite well informed about Dr. Faraday's habits, Mrs. Prothero." A delicate flush coloured Anne-Marie's cheeks. "The Colonel speaks often of his friends, and St. Mary Mead is a small village. One cannot help overhearing things." "Such as Dr. Faraday's interest in old newspaper articles about a drowned child," Miss Marple suggested mildly. Anne-Marie's composure faltered momentarily. I don't know what you mean." "Mrs. Prothero," Lawrence stepped forward, "did you know my brother Samuel? You would have been quite young when he drowned, but perhaps arrived in England only 5 years ago." Anne-Marie interrupted, her voice suddenly brittle. "I know nothing of events from 15 years past." She glanced at her delicate wristwatch. "If you'll excuse me, I should return to the Colonel. He becomes anxious when I'm away too long." After she departed, Professor Redding let out a low whistle. "Well, that was interesting. Did you notice how quickly she changed the subject?" "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And her claim about arriving in England 5 years ago doesn't align with what Mrs. Bantry once told me. She mentioned meeting a young Frenchwoman working as an au pair for the Mason family in Much Benham at least 12 years ago. A girl who strongly resembles Mrs. Prothero." Miss Clement frowned. "Could it be the same person? And if so, why would she lie about when she came to England?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, gathering her cardigan around her shoulders, "we should adjourn to the Vicarage and see what Inspector Craddock has discovered. I find these coincidences most intriguing." As they walked the short distance to the Vicarage, Miss Marple fell into step beside Lawrence. "Tell me, Mr. Timmins, did your brother Samuel have any particular friends in the village, children he played with regularly?" Lawrence's brow furrowed. "I was only 5 when he died, remember. But I do recall a girl who sometimes came to the house. Uncle Edward didn't approve, said she was a bad influence on Samuel. They used to sneak off together when adults weren't watching. Do you remember her name? Emmeline, I think. No, Evangeline." He shook his head. "Something with an E. She had long dark hair and spoke differently from the other children." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "How interesting." They arrived at the vicarage to find several people already gathered in the drawing-room. Colonel Prothero stood by the fireplace, scowling at the mantel clock. His wife sat primly on the sofa, carefully avoiding everyone's gaze. The vicar paced near the window, while his sister arranged teacups with nervous energy. Inspector Craddock stood by the door, nodding as Miss Marple's group entered. "Ah, good. Now we're only waiting for—" He was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, breathless and flushed, "So sorry to be late," she gasped, "but you'll never believe what I've just discovered. The maid at the Blue Boar saw someone entering Dr. Faraday's study through the garden window the night before the tea party." "Indeed." Inspector Craddock's professional interest was immediately piqued. "And did she recognize this person?" "She couldn't see clearly in the darkness," Mrs. Bantry replied dramatically, "but she's certain it was a woman wearing a distinctive brooch, silver, with blue forget-me-nots." All eyes in the room turned to Miss Clement, whose hand instinctively rose to the identical brooch pinned to her collar. To Chapter 6, The Librarians' Tale. Miss Clement's face drained of colour. Her fingers trembled as they touched the silver forget-me-not brooch at her collar. I can explain," she stammered, looking around the room as all eyes focused on her. "Yes, I visited Dr. Faraday's study that evening, but I certainly didn't harm him. Then perhaps you'd care to tell us why you were sneaking through windows after dark?" Colonel Prothero demanded, his military bearing accentuating his air of judgment. Inspector Craddock raised a placating hand. "Let's all remain calm. Miss Clement, I think you'd better explain your presence at Dr. Faraday's home." The librarian sank into the nearest chair, her usual composure shattered. "It was about the archives, the newspaper records he'd been researching. He telephoned me that evening, saying he'd found something crucial and needed my help immediately." She swallowed hard. "When I arrived, the front door was locked, but he'd told me to come around to the study window. He let me in himself." "And what was this crucial discovery?" Inspector Craddock asked. "A photograph." Miss Clement reached into her handbag, extracting a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This was published in the parish newsletter 3 weeks before Samuel drowned. It shows the annual village fete." Miss Marple accepted the clipping, studying it with her sharp eyes. "Ah, yes, I remember this day. Such lovely weather we had." The photograph showed rows of smiling villagers arranged before the church. Dr. Faraday stood in the back row, his arm around a woman who was clearly not Mrs. Faraday. In front of them stood 2 children, a boy who must have been Samuel and a dark-haired girl. Dr. Faraday pointed out this girl, Miss Clement continued, indicating the child. "He asked if I recognized her. When I couldn't place her, he became agitated, saying it changed everything, that his guilt had been misplaced all these years. Lawrence." Leaned over Miss Marple's shoulder. "That's her, the girl I mentioned, Samuel's friend." "But who is she?" Anmarie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Clement looked directly at the Colonel's wife. According to Dr. Faraday, her name was Evangeline Dupont. She was a French girl staying with relatives in the village that summer. A horrified silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to Anmarie Prothero, whose complexion had taken on a grey cast. "Non," she whispered. "That is impossible." Colonel Prothero stepped protectively toward his wife. "What exactly are you implying about Anmarie?" Miss Marple placed the photograph on a side table. "I believe Miss Clement is suggesting that Mrs. Prothero was once known as Evangeline Dupont, and that she knew Samuel Timmins before his death." Anne-Marie's elegant composure crumbled entirely. "It was so long ago," she said, her accent thickening with emotion. I never imagined I would return to this village." Her husband stared at her in confusion. "Anne-Marie, what is the meaning of this? You told me you'd never been to England before we met in Paris." "I lied," she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "I'd spent one summer here as a child. My aunt lived in the cottage near Gossington Lake. Samuel was my only friend that summer." Lawrence moved toward her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "You were there when he died." Anmarie nodded miserably. "We were playing by the lake. Dr. Faraday had forbidden Samuel to see me, but we met secretly. That day we were skipping stones when the doctor appeared. He was so angry, he grabbed Samuel roughly. I ran away, frightened by his shouting." A sob escaped her. "The next day I heard Samuel had drowned. My aunt sent me back to France immediately. I never knew, I never suspected. That Dr. Faraday might have been responsible for Samuel's death," Miss Marple completed gently. The vicar gasped. "Surely you can't be suggesting that Edward murdered his own son?" "I'm merely observing that many pieces of this puzzle are finally coming together," Miss Marple replied. "But there are still significant gaps." Inspector Craddock turned his attention back to Miss Clement. "You still haven't explained why Dr. Faraday showed you this photograph, or what happened afterward." The librarian twisted her hands in her lap. "He said he needed to set things right, that the wrong person had carried guilt for 15 years. He asked me to help him locate any relatives of Evangeline Dupont." Her eyes flickered to Anmarie. He had no idea she was now Mrs. Protheroe. "When I left him that night, he was drafting a letter to the original investigating officer about Samuel's case." "And the brooch?" Lawrence asked. "The forget-me-nots." Miss Clement touched it again. "Dr. Faraday gave it to me that night. Said it was found by the lake after Samuel drowned, but he'd kept it hidden all these years. He thought it might have belonged to Evangeline." She looked at Anmarie. "Did it?" Anmarie shook her head slowly. "No, I never owned such a brooch as a child." "Then whose was it?" the vicar's sister demanded. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "If I may make an observation, forget-me-nots often symbolize remembrance and true love. They're also commonly associated with secrets. Rather fitting, wouldn't you agree?" Before anyone could respond, the drawing-room door opened, revealing a police constable. "Inspector, sir," he said urgently, "Mrs. Faraday is asking to speak with you. Says she has a confession to make." "A confession?" Inspector Craddock's eyebrows rose. "About her husband's murder." The constable shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir. About the death of Samuel Timmins 15 years ago." Lawrence let out a strangled sound. What could she possibly have to do with my brother's drowning? She wasn't even married to Uncle Edward back then. "Actually," Professor Redding interjected quietly, "she was. Not as Mrs. Faraday, of course, but Elaine Hart was certainly Edward's first wife. They divorced shortly after Samuel's death. Edward married the current Mrs. Faraday, his former nurse, about a year later." "His first wife?" Lawrence repeated incredulously. "But that would mean that Elaine knew about Samuel's true parentage from the beginning," Miss Marple concluded, "and perhaps much more besides." Inspector Craddock straightened his tie. "I think it's time we heard Mrs. Faraday's confession. Miss Marple, would you care to accompany me? I've found your insights most valuable." As they prepared to leave, Miss Clement suddenly gasped. "Wait! There's one more thing Dr. Faraday mentioned that night. He said the writing on the farewell note explains everything. I assumed he meant a suicide note, but he died before I could ask for clarification. Farewell note? Lawrence frowned. What farewell note? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the light of discovery. I believe I know exactly what he meant. She turned to the inspector. Before we visit Mrs. Faraday, I think we should examine Dr. Faraday's study once more. The answer has been there all along, hiding in plain sight. Chapter 7. The Farewell. Note Dr. Faraday's study remained much as it had been on the day of his death. Medical journals lined the mahogany bookshelves, a half-written prescription pad lay abandoned on the desk, and family photographs in silver. Frames created the impression of a life suddenly interrupted. Inspector Craddock had insisted that nothing be disturbed until the investigation concluded, and so the room retained an eerie stillness, as if awaiting its master's return. Miss Marple moved through the space with quiet purpose, her keen eyes taking in details that others might dismiss. Lawrence and Miss Clement had accompanied them, while the rest remained at the vicarage with a constable, awaiting their return. "What exactly are we looking for?" Lawrence asked, running a finger along his uncle's desk. Dr. Faraday mentioned. "A farewell note," Miss Marple replied, examining the collection of framed photographs. "I believe he was referring to something quite specific." Inspector Craddock frowned. "We found no suicide note, if that's what you're suggesting." "No, I rather think it's something older." Miss Marple lifted a silver-framed photograph showing a smiling boy, Samuel, holding a toy sailboat. "Lawrence, did your brother leave any kind of note before he died?" Lawrence shook his head. "He was 7 years old, Miss Marple, and it was supposedly an accidental drowning." "Of course." She replaced the photograph and moved to a small writing desk in the corner, a delicate feminine piece that seemed out of place among the heavier masculine furniture. "This doesn't match the rest of his furnishings." "That belonged to my first aunt, Elaine," Lawrence explained. "Uncle Edward kept it even after they divorced and he remarried. I always thought, it's strange." Miss Marple ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, then pressed gently on various panels. "These old writing desks often contain secret compartments. My father had one quite similar." Her fingers found a small indentation beneath the drawer. When she pressed it, a narrow panel slid open, revealing a hidden space. "Well done, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said admiringly. From the compartment, Miss Marple extracted a yellowed envelope. Written on the front in a child's uneven script was, "To Daddy, goodbye." Lawrence's face paled. "Is that—" "I believe so." Miss Marple carefully opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. The childish handwriting was faded but still legible. "Dear Daddy, I'm sorry I made you angry. Evangeline is my friend, and I wanted to play with her. Please don't be mad at her. She didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to run away to London like in the books. Don't try to find me." "Samuel, a runaway note," Miss Clement whispered. "Not a suicide note. Samuel wasn't planning to drown himself. He was running away." Lawrence took the paper with trembling hands. "This changes everything. If Samuel was planning to run away, then his death might not have been an accident at all," Inspector Craddock finished grimly. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Faraday must have found this note after Samuel died. Perhaps it fell from the boy's pocket when they recovered his body. He would have realized Samuel wasn't playing by the lake. He was leaving. But who would want to harm a 7-year-old boy? Miss Clement asked. Someone who stood to lose something significant if certain truths came to light, Miss Marple suggested. Inspector, I think it's time we heard Mrs. Faraday's confession. The local police station was a modest building just off the village square. Mrs. Faraday had been provided with a cup of tea, which sat untouched before her. Her elegant bearing remained, though confinement had diminished some of her imperious manner. When Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock entered, accompanied by Lawrence and Miss Clement, she raised her chin defiantly. I see you've brought an audience, Inspector. These people have a vested interest in the truth, Mrs. Faraday, Craddock replied evenly. You mentioned having information about Samuel Timmons's death. Yes. Her gaze settled on Lawrence. After all these years, it seems appropriate that you should hear this, Lawrence. You've lived too long with lies. Then tell me the truth, Lawrence said, his voice tight with emotion. What happened to my brother? Mrs. Faraday folded her hands precisely on the table. I should begin by clarifying that I am indeed Edward's first wife. We were married when Samuel came into his care. She sighed. Edward was overjoyed to have his son, even though the circumstances were unconventional. Samuel's mother, Edward's former nurse, had died shortly after childbirth, leaving the boy in his father's care. But you divorced soon after Samuel's death, Miss Marple prompted gently. Yes. Her lips thinned. Edward was never the same after the drowning. He became obsessed with the idea that it was somehow his fault, that his argument with Samuel had driven the boy to the lake where he died. He couldn't forgive himself. But you knew better, Inspector Craddock suggested. Mrs. Faraday's eyes flashed. I knew Samuel hadn't simply wandered off and fallen into the lake, if that's what you mean. Edward found the farewell note afterward and was devastated. He believed Samuel had run away because of their argument and somehow ended up at the lake. But that doesn't explain why you divorced, Lawrence pressed. I left Edward because I couldn't bear the guilt any more, Mrs. Faraday whispered. You see, I was the one who found Samuel at the lake that day. He had his little suitcase with him, ready to set off for London. Her voice broke. I tried to convince him to return home, told him how worried his father would be. We argued. He became upset, ran along the dock. It was slippery from earlier rain. He fell. I saw him struggling in the water, but I couldn't swim. For sure you left him to drown? Lawrence's face contorted with horror. No! Tears spilled down Mrs. Faraday's cheeks. I ran for help. I truly did. But by the time Edward reached the lake, it was too late. Samuel was gone. She drew a shuddering breath. Edward never knew I was there. I couldn't bear to tell him that. I'd been the last person to see his son alive, that if I'd only been able to swim, Samuel might have lived. And so you carried that secret for 15 years, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Faraday nodded miserably. I divorced Edward, moved, away, tried to build a new life. Then, 3 years ago, I returned to find Edward had married Margaret, his nurse, just like Samuel's mother had been. History repeating itself. I was jealous, angry. I manoeuvred my way back into Edward's life, and eventually he left Margaret, for me. But recently, something changed, Inspector Craddock said. Yes. Edward began researching Samuel's death again. He found something, I don't know what, that made him question everything. She looked directly at Lawrence. I didn't poison Edward. Despite our complicated history, I loved him. I've done many shameful things, but murder is not among them. Miss Marple studied Mrs. Faraday's face carefully. There's something more, isn't there? Something you haven't told us about the day Samuel died. Mrs. Faraday's composure cracked entirely. There was someone else at the lake, she whispered. Someone watching from the trees. I didn't recognize them at the time, but now I believe it was Margaret, Edward's current wife, the woman who has spent 15 years plotting her revenge. Chapter 8. The Third Mrs. Faraday. Margaret! Lawrence's expression registered confusion. But I've never even met her. Uncle Edward never mentioned her. Few people in the village would remember her, Mrs. Faraday explained. She worked as Edward's nurse for only 8 months before they married, and they moved to London immediately afterward. Their marriage lasted barely 2 years before I re-entered the picture. Inspector Craddock's eyes narrowed. And you believe this Margaret had reason to harm Samuel 15 years ago? I didn't at the time, Mrs. Faraday admitted. I barely noticed her in the village back then. She was just another nurse at Edward's practice. But looking back, she was always there, hovering at the edges of our lives. Edward once mentioned that she'd been unusually interested in Samuel, offering to babysit, bringing him small gifts. Where is Margaret now? Miss Marple inquired gently. I don't know. When Edward and I remarried 3 years ago, he said she'd moved north, possibly to Scotland. He never spoke of her afterward. Miss Clement, who had been quietly observing, suddenly straightened. What was Margaret's maiden name? Walker, I believe. Margaret Walker. That's it, Miss Clement exclaimed. When I was organising the library archives, I found employment records from the village. There was a Margaret Walker who worked briefly as a nurse for Dr. Faraday about 16 years ago, but she left suddenly. The records show she returned 3 years later, right after Samuel's death. A thoughtful silence fell over the room. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her handbag. Inspector, she said finally, I believe we should learn more about Margaret Walker before proceeding further, particularly her whereabouts during the tea party. Agreed. Inspector Craddock turned to Mrs. Faraday. You'll remain here while we investigate these new developments. I must emphasize that you're still our primary suspect in your husband's murder. I understand, Mrs. Faraday replied with surprising dignity, but I've told you the truth. Whatever else I may be guilty of, I did not poison Edward. As they left the police station, Lawrence appeared deeply troubled. Could this Margaret really have murdered my uncle after all these years? And what possible connection could she have had to Samuel's death? I suspect, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that we're dealing with something far more complex than simple revenge. Tell me, Lawrence, did your uncle ever mention any significant events immediately before Samuel's death? Any changes in routine or unusual occurrences? Lawrence frowned, casting his mind back. There was something. Uncle Edward had been working late for several weeks, reviewing patient files. He seemed worried, though he wouldn't tell me why. And then, just days before Samuel died, I remember him arguing with someone on the telephone about proper procedures and reporting requirements. Miss Marple's eyes lit with interest. Professional concerns, perhaps. Inspector, I wonder if we might examine Dr. Faraday's medical records from that time. Those would be confidential, Craddock replied, though, under the circumstances, I might obtain a warrant. Perhaps there's an alternative approach, Miss Clement suggested. The library keeps bound copies of the medical register. If Dr. Faraday reported any unusual cases or published any research during that period, it would be noted there. Excellent suggestion, Miss Marple agreed. While the inspector pursues inquiries about Margaret Walker, perhaps we could examine those records. They parted ways outside the police station, with Inspector Craddock returning to the vicarage to question the remaining guests, while Miss Marple, Lawrence, and Miss Clement headed back to the library. The afternoon light was fading as they searched through the dusty medical journals. Lawrence, skimming through a volume from 15 years prior, suddenly paused. Here's something odd. Uncle Edward wrote a case study about a child who survived hydrangea poisoning. The symptoms he describes: respiratory difficulty, bluish discoloration, they're remarkably similar to how he died yesterday. Miss Marple peered over his shoulder. Most interesting. And the date of this publication? 2 months after Samuel's death. May I see? Miss Clement asked, accepting the journal. Her eyes widened as she read. The case study refers to a 7-year-old male patient who ingested hydrangea leaves thinking they were mint. That would have been Samuel's age. Suggesting what? Lawrence asked. That Samuel was poisoned before he drowned. It's possible, Miss Marple mused. Hydrangea contains small amounts of cyanide compounds. If Samuel ingested enough to make him ill, but not enough to kill him, he might have been disoriented when he reached the lake. That could explain why he fell from the dock. But who would poison a child? Miss Clement wondered. Someone who stood to gain from his death, Miss Marple replied. Or perhaps someone who wished to harm Dr. Faraday through his child. Lawrence shook his head in disbelief. This gets more disturbing by the hour. First, Samuel's drowning might not have been an accident, and now you're suggesting he was deliberately poisoned beforehand. We mustn't jump to conclusions, Miss Marple cautioned, but we should certainly consider all possibilities. Their research was interrupted by the library door swinging open. Mrs. Bantry rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. Jane! Oh, you'll never believe it. Inspector Craddock has just received word that Margaret Walker, Dr. Faraday's second wife, has been living right here in St. Mary Mead for the past 6 months. Indeed? Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her eyes sharpened with interest. Under her own name? No, that's just it, Mrs. Bantry continued breathlessly. She's been using a different name entirely. The inspector showed us her photograph, and we all recognized her immediately. Who is she? Lawrence demanded. Mrs. Bantry's eyes darted between them. It's Mrs. Prothero. Anmarie is actually Margaret Walker. A stunned silence fell over the library. Miss Clement was the first to recover her voice. That's impossible. Anmarie Prothero is the French girl who knew Samuel, Evangeline Dupont. No, dear, Mrs. Bantry corrected. That's what she wanted us to believe. The inspector just received confirmation from the French authorities. The real Evangeline Dupont died in Paris 12 years ago. Anmarie has been using her identity. Lawrence sank into a chair. So, the woman claiming to be Colonel Prothero's French wife is actually my uncle's second wife, the one who supposedly moved to Scotland." "It appears so," Miss Marple said quietly. "Which raises several interesting questions. Why would Margaret Walker assume a false identity to return to St. Mary Mead? Why marry Colonel Prothero? And most importantly, what is her connection to the deaths of both Samuel and Dr. Faraday?" Miss Clement gasped suddenly. "The brooch! The silver forget-me-nots that Dr. Faraday gave me. He said it was found by the lake after Samuel drowned. If Margaret was there that day, then the brooch might have been hers," Miss Marple concluded, a token dropped at the scene of a tragedy she helped orchestrate. Lawrence stood abruptly. "We need to find her immediately. If she killed my uncle—" "We must proceed carefully," Miss Marple cautioned. "Margaret Walker, or Anmarie, as we've known her, is clearly a calculating woman. If she's responsible for these deaths, confronting her directly could be dangerous." "The inspector has already sent constables to the Prothero estate," Mrs. Bantry informed them, "but she's nowhere to be found. The colonel is beside himself, claims he had no idea his wife wasn't who she claimed to be." "Then we must think," Miss Marple said firmly. "If I were Margaret Walker, with my carefully constructed identity unravelling, and the authorities closing in, where would I go?" Lawrence's expression suddenly changed. "The lake house," he said with certainty. "Uncle Edward kept a small cottage by Gossington Lake, the same lake where Samuel drowned. He never used it after. Samuel's death couldn't bear to, but he never sold it either." "The scene returns to where it began," Miss Marple murmured. "How appropriately theatrical." "I'll telephone Inspector Craddock," Miss Clement offered, rising quickly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And then I think we should pay a visit to Gossington Lake ourselves. I have a feeling we'll find more than just Margaret Walker there. We may finally uncover the truth that has remained hidden for 15 years. Chapter 9. Shadows by the lake dusk was settling over Gossington Lake as their small party approached the cottage. Inspector Craddock had insisted on leading the way, with a constable following close behind. Miss Marple, Lawrence, and Miss Clement had been instructed to remain at a safe distance, though Miss Marple had quietly positioned herself where she could observe both the cottage and the lake beyond. The structure was modest, a stone building with weathered shutters and an air of abandonment. 15 years of disuse had left it partially reclaimed by nature. Ivy climbed its walls, and the garden path had all but disappeared beneath encroaching weeds. "It doesn't appear that anyone's here," Lawrence whispered, peering through the gloom. "And yet," Miss Marple replied softly, "observe the chimney." A thin wisp of smoke curled upward into the darkening sky, almost invisible against the twilight, but unmistakable to Miss Marple's observant eyes. Inspector Craddock had noticed it as well. He motioned for the constable to circle around to the rear of the cottage while he approached the front door. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight as he climbed onto the small porch. From their vantage point several yards away, they watched as the inspector knocked firmly on the door. "Police! Open up, please!" Silence greeted his command. He knocked again, more insistently. "Margaret Walker, or should I say, Anmarie Prothero. We know you're inside. Please come out and speak with us." The cottage door remained stubbornly closed. Inspector Craddock exchanged glances with the constable, who had returned to the front of the building with a shake of his head, indicating no sign of movement at the rear. "I'm afraid we'll have to force entry," the inspector announced, his hand moving to his coat pocket. "That won't be necessary," came a voice from behind them. Everyone turned in surprise. At the edge of the lake stood Colonel Prothero, his military bearing unmistakable even in the fading light. Beside him stood his wife, or rather, the woman they now knew as Margaret Walker. "Ah, I see St. Mary Mead's finest minds have assembled," Margaret said, her French accent entirely gone, replaced by crisp, educated English tones. "I expected no less from Miss Marple." "You know me?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Edward spoke of you often," Margaret replied. "The village's amateur detective who sees everything and says little. He admired your discretion." She glanced toward the cottage. "Won't you all come inside? The evening grows chilly, and I believe we have much to discuss." Inspector Craddock stepped forward. "Margaret Walker, I must caution you that anything you say may be used as evidence." Yes, Inspector. I'm well aware of the formalities." She smiled thinly. "But I assure you, I have no intention of denying anything. Quite the contrary. I've waited 15 years to tell this story." Inside, the cottage proved to be surprisingly well maintained. A fire burned in the grate, casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with faded photographs. Most showed Samuel at various ages, his bright smile frozen in time. Margaret moved confidently through the space, lighting oil lamps that bathed the room in a warm glow. Colonel Prothero stood awkwardly by the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "You knew all along, didn't you, Richard?" she said, addressing the colonel with unexpected gentleness. "Some part of you sensed I wasn't who I claimed to be." "I knew only that I loved you," the colonel replied stiffly, "though it seems I never truly knew the woman I married." "Few of us are exactly who we appear to be," Margaret observed. She turned to Lawrence. "You've grown into a handsome young man. You have your brother's eyes." Lawrence stiffened. "You have no right to speak of Samuel." "On the contrary," Margaret countered, "I have every right. After all, Samuel was my son." The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute. Even Inspector Craddock appeared momentarily stunned. "Your son?" Lawrence finally managed. Margaret nodded, her gaze moving to a photograph on the mantelpiece. A younger Edward Faraday, with his arm around a nurse, a small boy between them. Edward and I had a brief affair while I worked as his nurse, before he married Elaine. I became pregnant, but Edward was determined to advance his career. A scandal would have ruined him. So we made an arrangement. I would have the child in time, private, and he would claim Samuel as an orphaned nephew he had nobly taken in. But Samuel wasn't his nephew, Miss Clement said slowly. He was his son, indeed. Edward could never resist staying close to his child, even if he couldn't acknowledge him publicly. He hired me back at his practice when Samuel was 6, allowing me brief, precious moments with my son, though Samuel never knew I was his mother. Her voice hardened. Then Elaine became suspicious. She pressured Edward to dismiss me, to cut all contact. He complied, choosing his marriage over his promise to me. Miss Marple studied Margaret thoughtfully. "So, you arranged to meet Samuel, secretly, perhaps through his friendship with Evangeline Dupont. Clever as ever, Miss Marple. Yes, my cousin's daughter was visiting from France that summer. I convinced her to befriend Samuel, to help me maintain a connection with my child. Margaret's eyes clouded with memory. Samuel was so bright, so curious. He deserved to know the truth about his parentage. And so you told him, Lawrence concluded. That's why he was running away that day. Margaret shook her head. No, I had arranged to meet him at the lake that afternoon, intending to tell him then. But when I arrived, I found Elaine arguing with him on the dock. I hid, watching, afraid of causing more trouble. Her voice broke slightly. I saw him fall, saw Elaine hesitate before running for help. By the time I reached the dock, Samuel had disappeared beneath the water. And you dropped your brooch, Miss Marple suggested gently. The silver forget-me-nots. Yes, in my haste to reach the water, Margaret's composure faltered. I couldn't save him either. The current had already carried him too far out, and, like Elaine, I couldn't swim. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. This is all very tragic, Mrs. Prothero, or Miss Walker, but it doesn't explain why you would murder Dr. Faraday 15 years later. Doesn't it? Margaret's eyes flashed. Edward knew I had been at the lake that day. He found my brooch. For 15 years, he let me believe I was partially responsible for Samuel's death because I hadn't acted quickly enough. He wrote to me occasionally, tormenting me with updates about the village, about his perfect life with his new wife. Then, 3 months ago, he contacted me again. About what? Lawrence asked. He had reviewed his old case notes and made a disturbing discovery. Samuel's symptoms before his death, symptoms I had attributed to a childhood illness, were actually consistent with mild hydrangea poisoning. Her gaze travelled to Miss Marple. Edward believed someone had deliberately poisoned Samuel with hydrangea leaves, made to look like mint in his tea. And he suspected you? Miss Marple concluded. Yes, as the nearest thing to a botanical expert, in his acquaintance at that time. Margaret shook her head bitterly. After 15 years of grief, to be accused of poisoning my own child. I returned to St. Mary Mead to confront him, to find the truth. Using a false identity, Inspector Craddock pointed out. I needed to move freely, to investigate without Edward knowing I had returned. The real Evangeline had died years before. It seemed fitting to borrow her identity, to complete the circle. Colonel Prothero made a pained sound. Our entire marriage has been a lie. Not entirely, Richard, Margaret replied quietly. I did grow fond of you. You were merely a means to an end initially. Your position in the village gave me access to Edward's social circle, but I came to appreciate your steadfastness. How comforting, the Colonel muttered. But you still haven't addressed the central question. Inspector Craddock persisted. Did you poison Dr. Faraday at the tea party? Margaret met his gaze directly. No, Inspector. Despite everything, I did not kill Edward. I wanted answers from him, not revenge. She turned to Miss Marple. But I believe you already know who did, don't you? Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gentle blue eyes suddenly sharp as steel. Yes, I believe I do, and I think it's time we all heard the complete truth about what happened, both 15 years ago and yesterday afternoon. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Revelation. The cottage fell silent as all eyes turned expectantly to Miss Marple. She appeared momentarily frail in the flickering lamplight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Yet there was nothing fragile about the keen intelligence in her gaze. "Before I explain my conclusions," she began, "I must ask Inspector Craddock if he received the information I requested about the medical register." The inspector nodded. "Just before we left for the lake, Dr. Faraday reported an unusual case of accidental poisoning 3 weeks before Samuel's death. A child who had ingested hydrangea leaves. The child recovered fully." "And the child's name?" Miss Marple prompted. "Emily Clement, aged 6. The inspector glanced at Miss Clement, whose face had gone deathly pale. "I take it you're related?" "My cousin's daughter," Miss Clement whispered. "She visited us that summer. I had forgotten." "Memory can be selective, particularly regarding traumatic events," Miss Marple observed gently. "Emily recovered, thankfully, but the incident would have made a significant impression on her family, including her aunt, the vicar's sister, who prepared most of the refreshments for yesterday's tea party." Lawrence leaned forward. "Are you suggesting Mrs. Clement poisoned my uncle? But why? What possible motive could she have?" "The strongest motive of all," Miss Marple replied. "A mother's need to protect her child." A confused silence followed this pronouncement. "But Mrs. Clement doesn't have children," Miss Clement protested. "Not now, perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "But 15 years ago she had a son, a boy she placed in the care of a respected doctor and his wife, believing they could provide him with advantages she could not." Understanding dawned on Margaret's face. "Samuel," she breathed. "You're saying Alice Clement was Samuel's mother, not me?" "I believe so," Miss Marple confirmed. "It would explain several puzzling aspects of this case. Dr. Faraday claimed Samuel as his nephew, yet went to extraordinary lengths to keep him, even maintaining that fiction after his divorce from Elaine. The vicar's sister has lived in Samuel's shadow for 15 years, watching from a distance, never able to acknowledge her own child." Lawrence shook his head in disbelief. "This is absurd. If Mrs. Clement was Samuel's mother, why would she harm him? You suggested she poisoned Uncle Edward to protect her child. But Samuel was already dead." "No," came a quiet voice from the cottage doorway. "He wasn't." Everyone turned to find Mrs. Clement, the vicar's sister, standing in the entrance, rain glistening on her dark coat. Behind her stood the vicar himself, his kind face etched with concern. "Alice," he said softly, "you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do, Leonard." She stepped into the room, her gaze finding Lawrence. "I never intended to harm Samuel. The hydrangea tea was meant for Elaine. I discovered she was mistreating him, being cruel when Edward wasn't present. I only wanted to make her ill enough that Edward would send Samuel away to school, where he'd be safe." Margaret rose sharply. "You're confessing to attempting to poison Elaine, and accidentally poisoning Samuel instead?" Mrs. Clement nodded miserably. "The teacups were switched. When I realized what had happened, I was horrified. Samuel recovered, thank God, but he was never quite the same afterward, more fragile. When he drowned weeks later, I was consumed with guilt, believing my actions had weakened him." "But you're claiming he didn't actually drown?" Inspector Craddock pressed. "What exactly are you saying happened to Samuel Timmins?" Mrs. Clement exchanged glances with her brother. "The boy who drowned that day wasn't Samuel. It was another child, a boy from the neighbouring village who resembled him. Samuel had run away, just as his note said he would. He made it to the train station, where Leonard found him. The vicar stepped forward. I couldn't bear to see my sisters suffering. When I found Samuel at the station, planning to run away to London, I made a decision. The opportunity presented itself when news came of an unidentified boy's body found in the lake. Through my position, I was able to influence the identification. You falsified a death, Inspector Craddock said, incredulously, to protect a living child. The vicar replied without apology. Samuel was terrified of returning to that house. He spoke of the bad lady who hurt him, not Elaine, as my sister had thought, but Margaret. He turned to Margaret. You had been giving him small doses of hydrangea tea for weeks, hadn't you? Building up his tolerance while making him chronically ill, so that Edward would be forced to send him away to a special facility, where you could gain access to him. Margaret's face contorted with outrage. That's a monstrous accusation. I would never harm my own child. But he wasn't your child, Miss Marple said quietly. Was he? Despite what you told us earlier. For the first time, Margaret's composure truly faltered. She looked wildly around the room, finding no allies in the sea of accusing faces. You can't prove any of this. Dr. Faraday could, Mrs. Clement said. He'd finally pieced it together. All these years, he believed Samuel had drowned, that he'd failed to protect his son. Then, 3 months ago, Leonard made a deathbed confession to a parishioner who had helped with the deception. Word reached Edward. He began investigating, reviewing old medical records, connecting the incidents of poisoning. Lawrence's face registered shock after shock. Are you saying Samuel is alive? All this time, I believed my brother was dead, and he's been alive. The vicar nodded solemnly. Samuel was given a new identity. He was raised by distant relatives of ours in Cornwall, away from everyone who might recognize him. And he prospered, Miss Marple added gently. Became a fine young man, a librarian, with a special interest in local history. She turned to Miss Clement. Isn't that right, Samuel? Miss Clement's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. I never intended to deceive anyone when I took the position here. I simply wanted to understand my own past. When Dr. Faraday began researching old newspaper archives, I realized he was discovering the truth. He recognized me almost immediately, said I had my mother's eyes. Lawrence stared at Miss Clement as if seeing her for the first time. The delicate features, the thoughtful expression, now transformed by revelation into something hauntingly familiar. Samuel? He whispered. Hello, Lawrence, she said softly. I've been watching over you from a distance, trying to find the right moment to tell you. I never forgot you, my little brother. The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Margaret sank back into her chair, her face ashen. It's not possible, she murmured. It cannot be. I assure you, it is, Miss Marple said firmly. And Dr. Faraday's discovery explains why he changed his will so abruptly, cutting out Lawrence in favor of the church. He knew he needed to protect both his boys. Providing for Lawrence through normal channels would have drawn attention once the truth emerged about Samuel. The church fund was merely a temporary repository until matters could be settled properly. Inspector Craddock, who had been listening with increasing astonishment, finally found his voice. This is all quite extraordinary, but it still doesn't resolve our current investigation. Who poisoned Dr. Faraday at the tea party? "That should be obvious now," Miss Marple replied. Once Dr. Faraday discovered that Samuel was alive, that Margaret had been attempting to poison him all those years ago, and that she had returned to the village under a false identity, he became a threat to her freedom and her carefully constructed new life. All eyes turned to Margaret, who had gone very still. "Edward contacted me 2 days before the tea party," she said coldly. "He claimed to have proof that I had systematically poisoned Samuel 15 years ago. Medical records, witness statements. He demanded I leave the village immediately, or he would expose everything." Her laugh was brittle. "He even had the audacity to suggest I needed psychological help. After everything he'd done, the lies he'd told about Samuel being his nephew, when he was never related to the boy at all." "So, you prepared a special cake," Inspector Craddock concluded, knowing that only Dr. Faraday would receive the poisoned slice. "He deserved to experience what he accused me of inflicting," Margaret hissed, "to feel his airways constricting, to know in his final moments that I had defeated him." Her gaze shifted to Miss Clement, to Samuel. "But it seems he had the last victory after all. You were never mine, were you? Not my child, not my flesh and blood. Just another tool in Edward's elaborate games." As Inspector Craddock moved to formally arrest Margaret Walker, Miss Marple turned to Lawrence and Miss Clement. "Family connections can be complicated," she observed gently, "but they can also be rebuilt. With time and understanding." Lawrence stared at the woman he now knew to be his long-lost brother. "Samuel," he said again, testing the name, "I have so many questions." Miss Clement, Samuel smiled tentatively, "and I have many answers to give. Perhaps we could start with a cup of tea. One without hydrangea leaves, I promise." Outside the cottage, the waters of Gossington Lake lapped quietly against the shore, bearing witness to the final unravelling of a mystery 15 years in the making. Chapter 11. Returning to Order 3. Days after Margaret Walker's arrest, St. Mary Mead was gradually returning to its usual peaceful rhythm. The morning mist hung delicately over the village green, as Miss Marple tended to her garden, deadheading the last of her summer roses. The methodical work gave her time to reflect on the extraordinary events that had unfolded. "I thought I might find you among your flowers," came a familiar voice. Miss Clement, or rather Samuel Timmins, stood at the garden gate, looking more at ease than Miss Marple had yet seen him. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "Do come in. The kettle has just boiled, and I believe we deserve a proper cup of tea after all the excitement." Inside her cottage, with china teacups steaming between them, Samuel studied the elderly lady with newfound appreciation. "Inspector Craddock told me you suspected my identity almost from the beginning. May I ask what gave me away?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Several small things. Your unusual interest in the old archives, for one. Then there was your reaction to Dr. Faraday's collapse. Genuine grief, but tinged with something else. Not guilt, as I first thought, but recognition. You knew exactly what was happening to him, because you'd experienced similar symptoms yourself, albeit in a milder form 15 years ago." "How observant of you," Samuel murmured. "Yes, as soon as I saw his lips turning blue, I knew. Hydrangea. Poisoning presents very distinctively. And then there was the brooch. Miss Marple continued. "You seemed genuinely surprised when Dr. Faraday gave it to you, saying it had been found by the lake. Yet you wore it with such reverence. It belonged to your mother, Alice Clement, didn't it?" Samuel nodded. "Mother gave it to me on my 7th shoe. Birthday, just weeks before everything changed. I lost it the day I ran away. Finding it again felt like a sign that it was time for the truth to emerge." He sipped his tea thoughtfully. "I never imagined the cost would be so high." "Dr. Faraday died protecting you," Miss Marple observed. "He could have exposed Margaret immediately upon discovering the truth, but he chose to confront her privately. First, a final act of atonement, perhaps," Samuel suggested. "For all the years he maintained the fiction that I was his nephew, when he knew perfectly well I was Alice Clement's child, entrusted to his care." A shadow crossed his face. "Lawrence is struggling with all these revelations, finding me only to discover I'm not who he thought I was, that we're not biological brothers after all. Family bonds aren't merely a matter of blood," Miss Marple said wisely. "You shared a childhood, however brief. Those connections endure." "I hope so," Samuel replied. "We're meeting later today. Lawrence has agreed to visit Mother, Alice, with me. It's time they were properly introduced." A gentle knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Lawrence himself stood on the threshold, looking somewhat awkward but determined. "Miss Marple." He greeted her with a brief bow. "Samuel, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Miss Marple assured him. "We were just discussing family connections." Lawrence entered, accepting the offered teacup with a nod of thanks. "Mrs. Faraday, Elaine, has been released," he informed them. "Inspector Craddock concluded she had no involvement in Uncle Edward's death. She's returning to London tomorrow." "And the Colonel?" Miss Marple inquired. "Devastated, naturally," Lawrence replied, finding that his wife of 3 years was actually a murderer using a false identity. Well, it's not something one recovers from quickly. The vicar has been spending time with him. Reverend Clement has a gift for offering comfort in difficult times, Miss Marple observed, though he faces his own challenges now. Helping to falsify a death certificate, however noble his intentions, has serious implications. Inspector Craddock believes the case will be handled discreetly, Samuel said. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the length of time that's passed. They fell silent for a moment, each contemplating the tangled web that had finally unravelled. Lawrence was the first to speak again. "I've been going through Uncle Edward's papers," he said. "He left detailed accounts of everything, Samuel's birth, the arrangement with Alice Clement, even his suspicions about Margaret's attempts to poison Samuel. It seems he maintained the pretense that Samuel was his nephew out of respect for Alice's wishes. She feared her brother's position in the church would be compromised if her indiscretion became known. And yet, Samuel mused, Leonard, uncle, vicar, risked everything to protect me in the end. Love often inspires remarkable courage, Miss Marple noted. Your mother couldn't acknowledge you publicly, but she never stopped watching over you from a distance. Lawrence turned to Samuel, his expression earnest. I found something else in Uncle Edward's papers. His real will, not the one he fabricated to protect his assets. You and I are his sole beneficiaries, Samuel. Equal shares in everything, including the medical practice. Samuel appeared momentarily stunned. "But I wasn't his child. Wasn't even related to him." "Perhaps not," Lawrence replied, "but you were his responsibility. And in the end, he tried to make amends for his part in the deception." He hesitated before adding, "When I was going through his things, I found an old photograph album. Pictures of us as children, you and me. I thought perhaps we could look through it together." The simple olive branch brought a smile to Samuel's face. "I'd like that very much." Miss Marple watched the tentative reconciliation with quiet satisfaction. "You know," she remarked, setting down her teacup, "this reminds me of something my grandmother used to say. Truth, like cream, eventually rises to the surface, and sometimes curdles in the process," Lawrence added with unexpected humour. Their laughter broke the last of the tension between them. As they prepared to leave for their meeting with Alice Clement, Samuel paused at Miss Marple's door. "How did you know Miss Marple? Not just about my identity, but about all of it. Margaret's deception, Mother's involvement, everything." Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes twinkling. "I've lived in St. Mary Mead for over 50 years, my dear. One observes a great deal about human nature in a village this size. People are remarkably similar everywhere, you know." When Mrs. Bantry mentioned Margaret Walker returning as Anmarie, using a dead girl's identity, it reminded me instantly of Mrs. Merridew's niece in the village pantomime last Christmas. The girl played 2 roles by simply changing her accent and her hairstyle. Most effective deception. Lawrence shook his head in amazement. To think that none of this would have come to light if Uncle Edward hadn't started researching old cases. "The past seldom remains buried forever," Miss Marple observed. "Much like bulbs planted in autumn. They remain hidden through the winter, but inevitably push toward the light when spring arrives." As they departed, Miss Marple returned to her garden, resuming her methodical deadheading. From here she could see the spire of St. Mary Mead Church, where Reverend Clement would soon preside over Dr. Faraday's funeral. She could glimpse the roof of the vicarage, where a family long divided would attempt to forge new connections. And, in the distance, the placid surface of Gossington Lake reflected the morning sun, its waters finally unburdened of the secrets they had held for 15 years. Miss Marple snipped a faded rose with her secateurs. The mystery was solved, justice was being served, and order was gradually returning to her beloved village. Until the next time human nature revealed its darker impulses, her knitting and her garden would provide ample occupation, just as she preferred it.